The game is rigged. The sad thing is that most people know that it is rigged. They are given a handful of choices between yes men or women, and they keep choosing from between them. There are usually not too many differences between them at the end of the day. They have a handful of wedge issues and talking points that they recycle, but they always seem to talk those issues in a circle. At the end of the day, they usually serve corporate interests over the interests of the citizens. But the people keep doing the same thing over and over because they're persuaded to by the media. The media only presents us with a handful of candidates from the two major parties. Albert Einstein once said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." The media is either owned by the same corporations who pay to keep the politicians in office or rake in money from their advertisers. If you were a billionaire and wanted to guarantee winning the Kentucky Derby, how do you do that? You buy all the horses. Does it really matter which party is in control when it seems like all we do is lose control of our country as a people?
We have the left versus the right, sort of embodied today in the Republican Party supposedly on the right and the Democrat Party supposedly on the left. Now here's a choice, isn't there? Well, why is it if this is such a choice? So we go from Republicans to Democrats, and then 4 years or 8 years later we go back to Republicans again, and we keep doing this. We've been doing this since World War I. How come the country keeps moving in the same direction all the time, deeper and deeper and deeper into collectivism, regardless of which party is in favor, because they both believe in collectivism. They both believe in big government. Their slogans are different, their leaders are different, but the poor voter out there trying to make sense of all this is, he's tricked, he's stuck, he's trapped. And so this is the important thing to, I think, understand, that this left-right paradigm is it's a political ploy. It works very well for those who know what they're doing. We find that the Republican Party and the Democrat Party both are pretty much in the hands of a relatively small group of people with a membership of about 4,000. It's called the Council on Foreign Relations. These are the people that are really pulling the strings in both the Republican and the Democrat Party. And they've even written about it. There's a fellow by the name of Carroll Quigley, who's a former history professor at Georgetown University. By the way, he was the mentor of William Clinton when Clinton was a student there. And he wrote several books about this group of people and their origins and their roots coming from Europe and England in particular. And he comes to a very interesting point in one of his books where he says, okay, this is the way the real world is. He said, how is it that we collectivists, we elitists, how can we rule the world when at the same time we want to let the average person think that they're living in a, quote, democracy. They're living in a system where their vote counts. They're living in this world in which they feel that they must participate in their own political destiny. This is a carefully nurtured myth that they want to create, so people will be content with no matter what happens to them, they'll say, well, I voted for it, or I did it. This government is my government. No matter how bad it is, it's responsible to me. And as long as people have that image, then they don't complain so much about how bad it gets, because they did it, they think. So Quigley deals with this question: how do you let people think that they're directing their own political destiny when at the same time we, the elite, we are the ones who must direct their political destiny without them knowing it? How do you do that? And he answers the question brilliantly. He said, it's very simple. You've got to have two major political parties, and they'll both have the same major goals, the same basic fundamental principles, and they'll argue with each other on the surface with slogans and leadership and style and all of that sort of thing. He said, but we will control them both.
Each state has their own senators and representatives in Congress, but do they represent the people or corporate interests? You already know the answer to that, and if you don't, you're either lying to yourself or have not been looking at the bigger picture. The opportunity for a level playing field in the capitalist system has slowly been taken away. Now the game is rigged only for certain players to win. It is rigged for the gold-collar workers to win. They keep getting richer while the middle class, made up of the blue and white collar workers, keep losing ground and the poor just stay poor. Whatever happened to the land of opportunity? America is a pay-to-play system. Big corporations' ability to run small businesses out of town has significant effects on the health of a local economy, the employment rate, the diversity and survival of small businesses in a town. Elected officials generally understand this dynamic and are inclined to take actions to protect small businesses. However, when larger business interests can provide unlimited funds to influence elections, elected officials can no longer afford to make decisions they know are best for their community, and those who try to make the decisions that would best suit the community can be run out of office.
The game is rigged, and it's rigged in favor of those who have money and who have power. Watch what happens in Wall Street. If you can hire an army of lobbyists and an army of lawyers, then you'll get what you need out of Washington. Washington will make sure that the rules work for you.
But more than $6 billion was spent on political campaigns in 2012. When it comes to federal elections, the candidate that raises the most money wins about 90% of the time. Since 1964, the re-election rate for members of the U.S. House of Representatives has never fallen below 85%.
Ever since the 2010 Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, this situation has become an even bigger problem. Now corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money on elections. The creation and subsequent rise of so-called super PACs is the most prominent post-Citizens United development. Regular PACs have been around for a long time, but could only accept contributions up to $5,000 from people. Super PACs are mutant PACs that can raise and then spend unlimited amounts of money from corporations, unions, and individuals on political advertisements, as long as they do not coordinate their spending with any candidate.
PACs, or Political Action Committees, have been around since the 1940s. They're private organizations that raise money for candidates or issues. Everyone from soda companies to pot smokers can form a PAC. And until recently, there were strict limits on how much money individuals could give to them. That all changed in 2010 when 2 Supreme Court decisions set off a campaign cash-feeding frenzy. One said that laws barring corporations and unions from spending money for political purposes violated the First Amendment. The second one ruled the caps on how much an individual can give to an independent political organization were also unconstitutional. And thus, the Super PAC was born. Technically called Independent Expenditure Only Committees, Super PACs can raise as much money as humanly possible from corporations, unions, and deep-pocketed fat cats. There are absolutely, positively zero limits on how much money they can raise or spend. And while super PACs are prohibited from coordinating with individual campaigns, they're often run by friends or associates of the candidates. So why does anybody care about these groups? Because we are talking big bucks going into influencing our democratic process.
Politicians spend much of their time raising money for their next election should they choose to stay in office. They tend to raise much of their money from industries that could live and die by their vote. Corporations throw boat tons of money into politicians' campaign coffers so that they can receive possible favorable treatment via legislative, regulatory, or benefits. This can be considered a form of legalized bribery. But the game is not just rigged for the corporations to win, it is rigged for the politicians, their friends, and families to win as well. Politicians can land a job working for some of the very same corporations and lobbying organizations who benefit off their votes, legislation, regulation, or deregulation. They call it the revolving door. Many politicians have relatives that lobby in Washington or land key jobs in industries that can profit off the very same politician's office.
It's called the revolving door, a very special phenomenon in U.S. politics. From the big business into U.S. Congress, and from U.S. Congress back into big business. U.S. senators and Congress members do not just get paid by the politicians contributing to their election campaigns. They also get to serve on the boards of the very same corporations that pour money into their campaign coffers.
Although the influence powerhouses that line Washington's K Street are just a few miles from the U.S. Capitol building, the most direct path between the two does not necessarily involve public transportation. Instead, it's through a door, a revolving door that shuffles former federal employees into jobs as lobbyists, consultants, and strategists, just as a door pulls former hired guns into government careers. While officials in the executive branch, Congress, and senior congressional staffers spin in and out of the private and public sectors, so too does privilege, power, access, and of course, money. There are 6,176 congressional staffers in the Open Secrets revolving door. Each election, members of Congress are defeated in their bid for re-election or choose to voluntarily leave office. The 2010 midterm election saw an exceptionally large number of sitting members leave.
Well, we have two revolving doors. We have what you just pointed out is in the Congress. I can recall when the chairman of the committee that passed the prescription drug plan under Medicare, after he passed it, he immediately resigned. This is before his term was up. And he went to a job representing the drug manufacturers for $1 million a year in compensation. This revolving door is not only within the Congress, it's within the military. You take generals that they retire, they're retained by the various networks to give their opinions on television. They're retained by manufacturers who who have contracts with the Defense Department. And so we got these two major revolving doors are really very serious. And the other revolving door that's not necessarily noticed is that a lot of members of Congress, after they leave the Congress, become lobbyists. They lobby, they go to law firms, and the law firms represent various economic interests, and it's their job to go back to their colleagues and point out to them what's in the best interest of the companies they represent, and also then to go to their fundraisers and contribute money when these people are raising money to run for re-election.
But it doesn't end there. This can be a two-way street. Politicians don't even need to hit the campaign trail to begin raising money for their next election. Sometimes all they have to do is threaten corporations with a piece of legislation or regulations that could affect them and their shareholders. It would be a shame to see something bad happen to your business. This is similar to a mob-style shakedown. Call it protection money, or better yet, call it legalized extortion. Politicians can also get inside information on future legislation that can help to line their pockets. Whether it is stock tips or getting rich off land deals, politicians have been getting rich off their office for years, and it is all legal. If you or I were to try these tactics, it would land us in jail, so they have essentially legalized corruption.
For example, insider trading on the stock market. If you are a member of Congress, those laws are deemed not to apply.
So congressmen get a pass on insider trading?
They do. The fact is, if you sit on a healthcare committee and you know that Medicare, for example, is considering not reimbursing for a certain drug, that's market-moving information. And if you can trade stock off of that information and do so legally, that's a great profit-making opportunity, and that sort of behavior goes on.
Why does Congress get a pass on this?
It's really the way the rules have been defined, and the people who make the rules are the political class in Washington, and they've conveniently written them in such a way that they don't apply to themselves. We know that during the healthcare debate, people were trading healthcare stocks. We know that during the financial crisis of 2008, they were getting out of the market before the rest of America really knew what was going on.
In mid-September 2008, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average still above 10,000, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke were holding closed-door briefings with congressional leaders and privately warning them that a global financial meltdown could occur within a few days. One of those attending was Alabama Representative Spencer Backus, then the ranking Republican member on the House Financial Services Committee, and now its chairman.
These meetings were so sensitive that they would actually confiscate cell phones and BlackBerries going into those meetings. What we know is that those meetings were held one day, and literally the next day, Congressman Baucus would engage in buying stock options based on apocalyptic briefings that he had had the day before from the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary. I mean, talk about a stock tip.
During the health care debate of 2009, members of Congress were trading health care stocks, including House Minority Leader John Boehner, who led the opposition against the so-called public option, government-funded insurance that would compete with private companies. Just days before the provision was finally killed off, Boehner bought health insurance stocks, all of which went up.
Congressmen and senators also seem to have a special knack for land and real estate deals. When Illinois Congressman Dennis Hastert became Speaker of the House in 1999, he was worth a few $100,000. He left the job 8 years later, a multimillionaire.
The road that Hastert wants to build will go through these farm fields right here.
In 2005, Speaker Hastert got a $207 million federal earmark to build the Prairie Parkway through these cornfields near his home. What Jan Strasma and his neighbors didn't know was that Hastert had also bought some land adjacent to where the highway is supposed to go.
5 months after this earmark went through, he sold that land and made a bundle of money.
How much?
$2 million.
What do you think of it?
It stinks.
We stopped by the former Speaker's farm to ask him about the land deal, but he was off in Washington, where he now works as a lobbyist. His office told us that property values in the area began to appreciate even before the earmark, and that the Hastert land was several miles from the nearest exit. But the same good fortune befell former New Hampshire Senator Judd Gregg, who helped steer nearly $70 million in government funds towards redeveloping this defunct Air Force base, which he and his brother both had a commercial interest in. Gregg has said that he violated no congressional rules.
It's but one more example of good things happening to powerful members of Congress. Another is the access to initial public stock offerings, the opportunity to buy a new stock at insider prices just as it goes on the market. They can be incredibly lucrative and hard to get.
If you were a senator, Steve, and I gave you $10,000 cash, one or both of us is probably going to go to jail. But if I'm a corporate executive and you're a senator, and I give you IPO shares in stock, and over the course of one day, that stock nets you $100,000, that's completely legal.
And former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her husband had participated in at least 8 IPOs. One of those came in 2008 from Visa, just as a troublesome piece of legislation that would have hurt credit card companies began making its way through the House. Undisturbed by a potential conflict of interest, the Pelosi's purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at the initial price of $44. 2 days later, it was trading at $64. The credit card legislation never made it to the floor of the House. Corporate executives, members of the executive branch, and all federal judges are subject to strict conflict of interest rules, but not the people who write the laws.
If you are a member of Congress and you sit on the Defense Committee, you are free to trade defense stock as much as you want to. If you're on the Senate Banking Committee, you can trade bank stock as much as you want, and that regularly goes on in all these committees.
There should only be one thing in your mind when you're drafting legislation. Is this good for the United States of America? That's it. If you're starting to say to yourself, how's this going to affect my investments?
It can be quite a jaw-dropping revelation when you realize how bad the game is rigged. The shocking thing is not what they do in Washington that is illegal, it is what they are doing that is legal. It is all legal because they write their own rules. They are the insiders. They do what is best for them and not for the people. Most of the politicians in Washington are bought and paid for, or are busy writing their own ticket. The game will never change until the riggers are taken out of the picture.